We find ourselves at a defining moment in global history. Breakthroughs in technology and innovation are reshaping the international landscape, presenting both challenges and opportunities to the United States. Artificial intelligence is leading the way toward this technological revolution, bringing up questions about the role of technological leadership in the strategic competition between the United States and China. Chief among these transformations is also the significant shift the use of artificial intelligence will spur. These shifts will impact innovation, economic growth, military planning, the future of the workforce, and manufacturing. In recognition of these changes, the United States is pursuing a bold agenda to sustain its technological edge. At the heart of this strategy is the U.S. AI Action Plan, which seeks to accelerate the adoption of artificial intelligence to enhance national competitiveness. Today's discussion will examine how the United States can strengthen its technological advantage, navigate evolving domestic manufacturing and workforce trends, and solidify its role as a leading technology power. In this spirit, Mr. Helberg joins us to discuss how the Trump administration is approaching AI economics and geopolitics. Jacob Helberg is an advisor for the White House Council of Economic Advisors, as well as the Undersecretary of State designate for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. He previously served as a senior advisor to the Chief Executive Officer of Palantir Technologies, as well as a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. We're also very fortunate today to have Paula Dobriansky moderating the event. Paula Dobriansky wears many hats. Most important to us, she's the vice chair of the Scowcroft Center's Advisory Council. She's also a senior fellow at Harvard and previously served as Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. Meetings like this are central to the Atlantic Council's mission of shaping the global future together. Today's event is co-hosted by three of our centers working together, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, the Geoeconomics Center, and the Atlantic Council's technology programs. Today's discussion is obviously public and on the record, and to all of you watching online, thank you as well for joining us. And without further ado, I'll turn to Ambassador Dobriansky. Ambassador.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to you, Jacob. Let's start with the first, maybe most basic question. What is the Trump administration policy on AI?
Well, first of all, thank you, Matt, for hosting this, and it's great to be here and see so many friends in the audience. The Trump administration policy on AI starts with a very simple premise, which is that AI is one of the most transformative technologies of this century and potentially on par with the creation of electricity and the first industrial revolution over 200 years ago. It is poised to lead to an economic step change in the global distribution of wealth, unseen in over 200 years. And so the basic strategy is to accelerate the development of artificial intelligence to make sure that America leads and dominates this new industry. The president in July gave a landmark speech, and he said that America is the birthplace of the artificial intelligence revolution, and it will win the AI race. And so that is, the administration developed a multi-pronged strategy in order to make sure that we put our foot on the gas pedal as much as possible.
What will be, in your estimation, the impact of AI on the global balance of power?
So it's such an important question, and I think to really appreciate the magnitude of how AI is poised to affect the global balance of power, it's actually relevant to look at history and how past technological revolutions impacted geopolitics in the past. And I think the closest analogy is the first industrial revolution. In the early 1800s, China and India's share of global GDP was cumulatively roughly 55% pre-industrial revolution. By the early 1900s, their share of global GDP collapsed to roughly 15%, averaging about 7.5% each. By contrast, Europe's share of global GDP skyrocketed from roughly 30% to 63% in 1913. And so if you think about the impact, the reason was entirely driven by the Industrial Revolution. Europe was the first to capitalize and modernize on the back of this new technology. And as a result, it completely dominated the global economy. It dominated the circulation of global trade flows. It had the strongest military. by the 1840s, 20,000 British troops defeated 100,000 Chinese troops in the first Opium War because of superior technology. And so I think we're going to probably see a similar step change where we're going to move from a world where for a long time a pervasive feature of the global economy was convergence, where emerging markets were catching up to quote-unquote industrialized economies. And we're probably going to see a new great divergence, similar to what we saw in the 1800s, where AI-led economies are probably going to start diverging from the rest of the world with GDP growth, annualized growth that are significantly higher than countries that are not exploiting this new technology.
So is it fair to say the economics of AI will upend the global balance of power? Is that what we can expect? That's what I'm hearing you say.
It's absolutely fair to say that. It's also fair to say that part of what we've seen accelerate since President Trump's inauguration is the acceleration of the global economy reorganizing around AI supply chains, around the top layer of the AI stack. And one of the things that's incredibly exciting is that the global economy is mostly reorganizing around America. That is evidenced by the fact that America is now going to benefit from over $1 trillion in investment per year, probably for the next decade in private investment. CapEx investments in AI infrastructure now exceeds consumer spending, which is notable because consumer spending has been about 2/3 of US GDP for most of the last 25 years. We've been primarily a consumption services-led economy, and we're seeing that changing for the first time in 50 years. We're seeing leading indicators where the US economy is starting to become more production-driven and with heavy investments in CapEx, with investments in R&D exceeding, going from the low between 1% and 2% in the early 2000s to now 3.6% this year, and it'll probably exceed between 4% and 5% by the end of next year. So it's incredibly exciting. We are going to need a lot of energy to power all this growth. The administration has a very bold plan to dramatically increase energy supply, and it's going to be full steam ahead.
So that's, in a way, my next question. Is the United States well positioned to leverage these changes and to make us more competitive and to have the benefits of this technological revolution?
Absolutely. So let's break down a little bit what the administration is doing. The administration has pursued a very robust trade agenda. So let me just preface by saying that there are different philosophical approaches that different administrations have taken, towards this great challenge. And, there is one approach that has focused on trying to position the U.S. government to do a lot of things in-house with public investments in a whole variety of areas. The alternative approach, which is largely the approach of the Trump administration, is to actually, rather than get the government in the business of being on the front lines of using taxpayer dollars to make all sorts of public investments, using the government to create the macroeconomic investment climate and create the conditions that actually allows and enables prosperity and the development of the technology itself here. And so how has the administration created this macroeconomic environment? It's done that through trade renegotiations, where we have over $1 trillion of trade deficit every year with our top 12 trading partners. The administration has taken on this challenge by renegotiating our trade deals, and it has now renegotiated over 10 trade deals with over 10 different countries, most notably Japan, the EU, Indonesia, the UK. And so this is going to actually help create conditions where investments in CapEx investments and investments in manufacturing here will be able to actually economically compete on a more level playing field with our top trading partners. The second point is on tax incentives. The One Big Beautiful Bill has actually created tax incentives, full expensing for intensive CapEx incentives in the US. So if you're a company and you invest in heavy industrial capital investments, you can write that off in your taxes. The third point is deregulation. We see internationally that there has never been an economic miracle in an economy that is mostly overregulated. In fact, there's probably a direct inverse correlation between overregulation and economic growth. And so this administration understands that. It's used the One Big Beautiful Bill to reform NEPA. It has taken executive action to expedite permitting for the construction of AI data centers as well as infrastructure projects. The other point is energy. So the president has expanded leasing in Alaska and reopened ANWR. He has published an executive order to use the Defense Production Act in order to revitalize our nuclear energy production in the U.S. We need about 100 million tons of nuclear energy per year, and we only produce 80,000 of it here. So obviously, we need to do better than produce 1% of our total nuclear energy supply. And the president set a very ambitious goal of opening 10 new nuclear reactors. Nuclear energy is an incredibly promising technology that offers the prospect for abundant, low-cost energy, which is direly needed if we want to build AI factories and if we want to reboot manufacturing here. So these are just different prongs of the administration's approach, and it's exciting to see a net gain of 16 million jobs in this country. And so I think one of the interesting features of this debate is people only focus on the jobs that they believe will get displaced by AI, but there's a little bit of a failure of imagination where it's hard to imagine and forecast the jobs that don't exist yet. And so they assume that no jobs will actually get created. But that hypothesis actually runs contrary to not just historical data, but to current data because unemployment is already at 4%. So I actually think if you look at firms that are already including AI, you would think, if you accept that thesis is true, that firms using AI are laying people off. What we're seeing is that firms incorporating AI into their operations increase their revenue per employee by 40%, and that those firms actually expanded their hiring, not reduced it, because they have more resources, they want to increase their production, they want to gain market share and compete, and they don't want to compete against competitors that are going to do the same thing and actually outproduce them. And so if you multiply that in aggregate, that is at a firm level. Think about what that does to a country's GDP when you multiply that, when you multiply a 40% increase in revenue per employee by the thousands of companies across the economy. So I think what we're looking at is actually a step change in the growth band of the country from ranging primarily between 1% and 3% per year to potentially between 3% and 6%, which is why people talk about this being analogous to the shift from an agrarian society to an industrial society. When the world was dominated by agrarian societies, the economy grew between 0% and 1%. When the Industrial Revolution came about, growth moved up between 1% and 3%, which is where it's been for roughly 150 years. We could actually be moving to a world where the economy grows between 3% and 4%. And Secretary Lutnick recently mentioned that he wouldn't be surprised if we're at 3.3% this year, we could hit 4% next year. And that has significant repercussions on not just the global distribution of wealth, but as well as obviously the global balance of power. And so I think the answer isn't just to be, it's being afraid. Looking at AI with trepidation is actually a red herring. If we don't embrace AI, we will be at a significant economic disadvantage because AI will happen no matter what. If we want to create jobs, we need our companies to compete. We need our economy to be competitive. And to do that, we actually need to lead in AI and lean into it rather than run away from it.
I think this point about unemployment is really a key one because, regrettably, in some quarters, that myth seems to be circulating and circulating. But you really provided, I think, a very clear and cogent answer to that. Let's go to China, if we can. And let me ask you, who's better positioned, the United States or China in AI?
So China obviously remains an incredibly formidable competitor. And they have the advantage. So a lot of literature has been published over the last 10 years that goes on and on about how China has a natural advantage by virtue of the amount of data that it has, and it is unconstrained by privacy regulations and can therefore harvest that data pretty much at will in order to train its large language models. Fundamentally, their big disadvantage is the fact that they have a government that can't help but crack down on everyone that's successful, frankly, including its tech companies. And we're seeing that with their own, action plan that they published and their safety framework that they published just a few weeks ago, that aims that, really it's obviously cloaked under words like safety, but really what it means is it provides the government a mandate to encroach and tighten its control over the private sector, which is obviously been the direction of travel for some time now. And so, the reality is, some people in the business community will say that China is so formidable that we just need to accommodate them, and and because they're destined to overtake us. There's the other school of thought that says that China is actually so far behind because they're a developing country, because their GDP per capita is actually so much farther behind that we don't even need to worry about them. Those two theses seem in contradiction, but they converge over the idea that America needs to actually embrace inaction, and we just don't need to worry about China. I think the reality is that it's going to be a close contest, that we have actually agency over determining and driving the outcome of that contest, and that's why this administration has had an America strategy to make sure that we encourage that America is the best destination for capital and for talent. And you're seeing that borne out in the numbers because the $1 trillion of private investments that have been committed in the U.S. are leading to things like the Arizona investments in Arizona and TSMC announcing $500 billion in investments in private capital, not taxpayer funding, to reboot semiconductor manufacturing in America. Hyundai, Mitsubishi, all these companies are investing in industrial activities here. And so we need to be focused on making sure that America is the best place to invest, which is exactly what we're doing. And, historically, that's been a recipe for success for us. I'm very skeptical that China's heavy-handed approach is actually going to prove successful, and I feel confident in our approach.
Let me take it a step further, or maybe broader. How do you see this fitting in the overall Trump administration policy towards China? Because you began in mentioning about, the issue about trade, tariffs. There's also the military component. In fact, it was President Trump who was the first person who elevated the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, our partnership with the countries in Asia, Japan, India, Australia, and us. How do you see this fitting in a broader sense? Can you comment on that a bit?
Yeah, so
I
think the general approach of the administration is really to focus on, what our needs as a country is to have an America-centric approach and focus on what we need as a country to secure our economy, to make sure that our economy cannot be held hostage by a foreign power, and to ensure that we have all of the conditions and that our companies have all of the conditions that they need in order to build products, innovate, and compete internationally. That's why we've been focused on trade deals, on deregulation, on private investment. And so fundamentally, when we think internationally about how that translates to an approach with foreign partners, that's going to mean engaging a lot of foreign partners around supply chain security and making sure that our supply chains, that the trends that we're currently seeing on how the economy is reorganizing around AI ends in an end state that means that our supply chains are secured and are not overly exposed to geopolitical adversaries. And so, there's a lot of work that's being done on mineral security. There's a lot of work that's being done on manufacturing, and so the agenda on trade connects to the agenda on energy, which connects to the agenda on deregulation. Mm-hmm. It's all about boosting American competitiveness, making sure that we have a domestic production capacity that actually meets certain national security needs, but that also we can engage foreign partners who we trust in order to bring our economic policy more closely in line with our national security strategy. And if I could just end on one point, for a long time, I think this is a philosophical shift, because for a long time, the consensus of the establishment was to completely decouple trade and economic policy from national security. The saying back in the day, which has now been mostly debunked, was potato chips, computer chips, it doesn't matter. And actually it does matter. And so we're actually, the shift that we're seeing, in intellectual debates, but also in policy, is that economic policy is actually becoming much, much more closely tethered to national security. And you can't just have those two things exist in parallel. They have to exist together. And so that's the basic approach of the administration.
I was going to say 100%. There have been some military types who have said this in the past, but you're right, it didn't get traction, and now it's really being advanced in the Trump administration. You mentioned allies, partners, these kinds of relationships. Let's talk a bit about that, about this area, this domain, what we can be doing with NATO, AUKUS, all of these kinds of partnerships. What's the value? How can we have a multiplier effect and a greater influence globally as a result of it?
So obviously, the approach of the administration towards a lot of these multilateral forums is something that is still taking shape. With NATO, the primary focus up until this point was increasing military spending up to 5%, which President Trump has very successfully achieved, and ending the war in Ukraine, which is obviously a very hard negotiation and which is very much still being ironed out. And so I think generally speaking, there is a choice before us, which is, do we want to use existing frameworks and processes and retrofit our strategy to those frameworks and processes, or do we actually just pursue a strategy that has its own tailored approach? And what I mean by that is NATO, the G20, APEC, all of these different types of groupings are processes. And so I think there's a meta-level question as, do we retrofit our strategy to a process, or do we actually create a process that is tailored to the strategy? I think that is something that we'll probably see play out over the next few years.
But not looking at fitting into the current frameworks, but looking at how one can actually use, in this sense, I'm not speaking of institutions, but relationships that we have to really further this agenda. It seems to me that there's really that great opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the main benefit of using the existing frameworks is that they already exist, that we have great relationships with a lot of them. The main drawback is that when we talk about the AI supply chain, these groups are not monolithic. They're very different countries, and so they actually have very different attributes. If you look at the G20, South Korea and Japan have a totally different place in the global supply chain than France does, if you look at other country groupings like ASEAN, for example, Southeast Asia is a leader in mineral production, and which is which occupies a very different place in the supply chain stack than countries like South Korea, which are closer to the top of the stack with semiconductor manufacturing. And so the topics and verticals that we choose to focus on with each country is going to have to necessarily be tethered to what their unique comparative advantages are. With that being said, I mean, existing using frameworks to have those conversations makes a great deal of sense, and I think you're seeing the administration do that.
Say a word also, not just, I've asked you about our allies, our partners, but the private sector is key in this effort. I was in Australia in August, and actually about a year ago in Australia, one of our companies, this is Amazon Web Services, they happened to conclude an MOU with the Australian government's Ministry of Defense. So Australia is one of our Five Eyes countries where we have a close intel relationship. And here they were helping in terms of data. And of course, the importance of AI in this mix loomed large. Say a word about that, because also it's not just about governments, but also about the private sector. And I think you've been very outspoken on that front, as I've seen you.
Absolutely.
You've written and you've spoken.
Yeah. So I co-founded a grouping called the Hill and Valley Forum, which brings together tech CEOs and policymakers on a bipartisan basis to create a home to help solve our hardest national security challenges with the best technology available on the market. And fundamentally, you're right that the private sector is an indispensable partner in that mission. And the reason is that most of our innovation, most of our R&D investment, it all comes out of the private sector. 80% of all R&D investment in the U.S. is entirely private sector driven. The government, does very little of this in-house these days, and the private sector just is leaps and bounds farther ahead. And so the only way that we actually bring about a coherent strategy is to do it in tandem with private sector actors. And let me just give an example. So if we have a mineral security strategy, the only way, the government can do things like stockpiles and, it can explore, it can consider potential approaches like the Defense Production Act. But fundamentally, the only way to have a mineral security strategy that works over time is through offtake agreements. To make sure that companies like NVIDIA, like Apple, become customers for non-CCP refined minerals. And that's why it was incredibly significant when Tim Cook came to the Oval Office and actually rolled out his plans to build a completely American silicon supply chain in the U.S. and unveiled a partnership with NP Materials, which operates the Mountain Pass mine in America. And so offtake agreements are key. That's one example of how working with the private sector is going to be essential, and ultimately that model will be replicated, I think, in a great deal number of other verticals.
Absolutely. No, I really wanted you to comment on this because it's already been happening. As you mentioned, Tim Cook's visit to the White House. And at the same time, there are others that are just moving forward. And the opportunities are there. And the Australian case is a really interesting one. It's one I'm familiar with. And actually, their Ministry of Defense also supports your comment before about economic security, and then also in terms of traditional national security, if you will. Let me ask you a different question. And this one, I have to look down to say this precisely. What does export the USAI tech stack to compete with China mean? I wonder that question. I'd like you to answer that question. I wonder what that means.
So fundamentally, so here's what it means. We saw over the last 20 years that China built the only solution for 5G. What that meant was we had to spend billions of dollars and an enormous amount of diplomatic capital to go around the world and convince other countries to not use Chinese 5G, which was much cheaper. And the alternative was not an American company, it was a European company called Nokia and Ericsson. The reason was that if you control the internet at the hardware level, you can compromise everything that sits on top of it. That obviously is not so much of a problem if you're dealing with a company that's actually a private company, as is the case in most of the West. It's a really big problem if you're talking about a Chinese company which has direct ties to the PLA and is an instrument of the Chinese Communist Party, which is obviously the case for Huawei. The key with the tech stack is we need to make sure that as the AI industry explodes and grows very fast internationally, that people build their AI ecosystems on top of the American stack. What that means is hardware, it means foundation models, and it means applications. Exporting that stack means people will be using NVIDIA chips. It means people will be using US hyperscalers. It means people will be using American foundation models and fine-tuning them to build applications fit for their use cases. And so right now there's a really big debate going on what the right balance is between making sure that we can, the most contentious part of this debate really centers around the export of high-end chips. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, there are different types of chips. There's memory chips, there's logic chips, and there's analog chips. The most vexing part of this debate really focuses on the most advanced logic chips that are on the frontier. Ultimately, there's most chips are not actually subject to export controls. So the debate focuses on how do you calibrate national security concerns over our most prized technology with the competing goal of making sure that the rest of the world builds on top of the stack, so to speak. That is, there is no contentious debate around exporting open source models and exporting even closed source models. We want the rest of the world to use American models. And so from that standpoint, there's a great deal of consensus on the fact that we need to do a better job at making sure that at promoting American companies overseas. Ultimately, the export control debate remains a heated one, but there's clearly a way to thread this needle, which the administration will likely roll out in the next few months.
Well, a follow-up question is there a certain part of the stack that sort of sticks out as a priority? Fabrication, data centers, frontier models. How do you exactly prioritize that?
So as we saw during COVID, we need to have a minimum viable production capacity here in a way that our economic security is guaranteed in all events. And that means making sure that our domestic production capacity for semiconductors ramps up significantly, which is why semiconductor manufacturing has been a major focus over the last few months. With respect to model development, we need to stay at the frontier of having the most advanced models. That means being able to upgrade our energy, our power grids, in order to have the kind of energy that we need to have large computing clusters in order to allow our AI labs to actually train the world's largest models. The interesting issue that we're seeing is AI labs are energy constrained right now. So the bottleneck is not capital. There's a lot of capital that AI labs are deploying. The problem is that even if you have unlimited capital, you need a power grid that can feed a massive amount of energy towards these computing clusters. And that's why the administration has really prioritized energy as a key pillar of this strategy. So semiconductor manufacturing is a key exposure point that we need to address. Mineral security is a key exposure point that we need to address. The energy layer, we have a lot of energy, but we need to grow our supply of energy over the next decade. And then the top of the layer, we need to make sure that we actually export the top of the layer as much as possible, especially for foundation models and applications.
Okay. What about dual-use technologies here? How does our strategy deal with that challenge of dual-use technologies?
So that's such an important point. And one of the under-discussed trends that we're seeing emerge is that over the next decade, over $2.7 trillion in public investments will be spent on defense. So that is a complete sea change from where we were just a few years ago. The big trillion-dollar question is, what will governments spend it on? We're seeing governments like Sweden, Japan, Germany, all rearming, building out their defense budgets. And the big question is, where will that capital go? I think the recent conflicts in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine actually highlighted to governments the need and the primacy of artificial intelligence on battleground scenarios. So fundamentally, what that means with respect to dual-use technologies is I think they are seeing how autonomous systems, how image recognition systems, as well as systems like common operating pictures are actually leading to determinative outcomes on the battlefield. So, I think we're just scratching the surface on on military use cases for artificial intelligence. One of the reasons why you're seeing the debate on export control play out so contentiously is because people, I think, intuitively understand that these technologies are fundamentally dual use. And that's why there's a big debate. And if I could just end on one point, the big metaphorical question in the export control debate that sort of touches upon this dual use issue that you highlighted is what analogy we are, as a country, are going to adopt for AI. Are we going to say that it's like the atomic bomb, which some people